I guess the election results that just came in tell us that the issues that people perhaps in this audience have with Common Core are much more widely spread than just here. That state superintendents in a number of states lost in their positions to opponents whose only platform was, the first thing I'm going to do when I get in is get rid of Common Core, and then that governors had to back off of their support of Common Core throughout the majority of the states in this country because it threatened their re-elections. So I think we can safely assume that there is widespread concern about what's going on with Common Core. And let's see, and so what I'm going to do is to fill in some background that unfortunately will probably increase your concerns. And these are things that went on in the validation committee, of which I was also a member, and indeed I was the only content PhD on the evaluation committee. All the other members who had an advanced degree had their advanced degrees in education, EDDs, not PhDs. There's a huge difference. And so as a result, I was the only content expert on the validation committee, and I was in mathematics. I still am, I think. So almost by default, I was the one who interfaced between the validation committee and the math writing team. So basically, I was the validations committee's representative overseeing the writing of the standards by the writing team. So to understand a little bit more about that, I'm quickly going to review the charge to the committee. The charge to the validation committee was to review the research for and the validity of that research for every standard in the Common Core standards, and if there is a standard that is missing and that you can show by existing research is essential to the development of your standards, or is something that is common or even universal in the standards of the high-achieving countries, then you have the authority to put that in whether the writing team agrees or not. So you can see that the validation committee was a very powerful influence on the structure and development of the Common Core. And as I say, by default, you're looking at the guy who was overseeing the math writing. Well, what happened? That's all fine in theory, and people look at it and say, look, he had that's validation committee. 23 members of the validation committee signed off on this thing, and only 5. Actually, in the world of education, 5 out of 28 or 29 is huge. The tendency in education is to be unanimous. And 5 out of 29 is just huge. That's a large number of people who declined to sign off. But anyway, so I was one of this group that signed off, and I'm going to try to tell you what happened. So I refused. And I'm going to tell you what my reasons were. Okay. So the thing that you have to understand, Sandy told you a little about the beginnings of this process, that there was initial development of high school standards and then they were written, so the rough in of them was given initially, and then this writing team wrote up detailed standards based on the expectations in this rough version, and that was the first draft that came out in September of 2009. Okay, I read it. I wouldn't have come onto the committee as California's representative, because that's what I was. I wouldn't have come onto the committee if I wasn't strongly in favor of having good, solid, respectable, nationally based and used standards. And so we got the first draft, and the first draft in mathematics stopped with an Algebra 1 course. There was no mathematics on that set of standards that went beyond Algebra 1. Now, what does that mean? Remember that the standards were advertised, and they were advertised to me and to Sandy as well this way. They were advertised as making students career and college ready, and were supposed to be benchmarked to the best of the international standards. So we would be able to be competitive with the people who currently, or had 4 years ago, were just wiping us out in terms of the degree of knowledge they had coming up out of high school in these other countries, the high-achieving countries, versus us. One bit of datum that might be of help here is this: the only time we participated in one of these international tests at the 11th grade level. So there are 4th grade, 8th grade, and 11th grade level tests that are given every 2 or 4 or 8 years internationally to any nation that wants to pay to get into them. And we competed on the 11th grade level only once. We generally compete on 4 and 8. And you don't see any of our 11th grade results, because here's what they are. In 1995, we competed in our only 11th grade test from TIMSS. And what did we do? How did we do? Well, the really high-achieving countries didn't participate. They didn't need to. They knew where they stood. But we participated because we thought it was a good idea, and we thought we would beat the pants off the countries that remained. You know where we came in? Dead last. Dead last. Technically only 2 countries scored below us, but their scores were 0 since they were disqualified. So we're not doing so well. And so I was reasoning that uniform, strong standards that would prepare people, as we said, for college and career would be just the thing we needed, especially if they were internationally benchmarked. Okay? And so that was my perspective. And when I saw the Algebra 1, that these things ended with Algebra 1, I started looking into it. It didn't seem sensible to me. And I rapidly found from statistics as it was available from the National Center for Education Statistics, that's a subdirectorate in the U.S. Department of Education, I rapidly found the following data. What happens if you leave high school with only an Algebra 1 background and attempt to go to college and expect to get a degree in due course? Their data showed me, or told me, it was specific data for this situation, that if you stopped with Algebra 1, then there was a 7% chance that you would ever get a college degree in any area. Not him, any area, 7%. And okay, And my gosh, I was thinking to myself, look, this can't be considered college ready. You can't say that a kid is college ready if he has a 7%, or she has a 7% chance of getting a degree. That's crazy. So I went and talked to the lead authors on the writing teams, both of whom were competent mathematicians. That is, they had PhDs in the subject. And I said to them, this is weird. This is crazy. We can't stop at that level, because this is the data that we're dealing with. You have defined college ready to be a 7% chance of getting a degree. And that's just irrational. And they said, look, Jim, you don't have to convince us. We know. But we were told what we were supposed to do. And they looked at me, and it was quite clear that they fully expected that I would go and talk to the people that had told them this and explain to them that this simply wouldn't fly. That level would not fly. And that's what I did. I went over to Achieve and talked to the people who were telling the writing team that Algebra 1 was where we stop, because it had been decreed that Algebra 1 is all you need to get through college. There was no evidence, but it was decreed. And I talked to these people, and I showed them all sorts of evidence for what this means. I showed them what was actually going on in the really high-achieving countries, which is scary when you compare it to this sort of feeble business. And I showed them what the Presidential Commission on Mathematics had just come up with, what they assumed was an absolute minimum, which went fully through Algebra 2, and they said that's only the beginning. There has to be a pathway to calculus available. And I showed them all of this material from all sorts of sources, and they were getting more and more glum. And finally, we stopped discussing it, and I went away, and a few days later, I heard from the writing team that they were going to be able to go and add a week geometry course and a week Algebra 2 course. They were pleased because they thought I could do my magic again and get into the standards a pathway to calculus. Unfortunately, I could not, and the reason that I could not was that suddenly the charge of the validation committee was dramatically changed. So we received about 4 days later, the validation committee as a whole received a letter from unnamed sources who presumably were the real leaders of the project, but we never saw who they were. They were never identified. And it announced to us that we could no longer talk to the members of the writing teams, and we no longer had the right to add standards to that were missing to the set of standards the writing team produced. And indeed, the only thing we were required to do was to sign a letter saying that the standards were excellent and benchmarked against the top achieving countries in the world. I'm a mathematician. I'm not an educator, and I'm even a lousy teacher when it comes down to that at Stanford. Well, one thing that mathematicians are pretty universal about is if something is wrong, then we simply won't go along with it. So I tried my best. I tried to get higher level standards in there, but it just wasn't going to happen. And since the resulting standards, Common Core standards in mathematics, were not internationally benchmarked against the high-achieving countries, but simply internationally benchmarked, which is a vacuous statement. It says, gee, I looked at the standards of Taiwan and Hong Kong and Singapore and places like that really do well, and I looked at them, and there they